Sensible Software is a company which is perhaps more famous in the UK than the rest of the world. Founded in Chelmsford, Essex, UK in 1986 by Jon Hare and Chris Yates, two former school friends, Sensible Software was one of the most successful UK development teams throughout the 8-bit and 16-bit eras, known for its innovative and humorous titles, creating no less than 7 #1 games in the UK in their 13-year history and scooping many industry awards in the process. Well regarded as eccentric mavericks, the team produced some strange and original games over the years, such as Sensible Soccer games, including Sensible World of Soccer, the Cannon Fodder games and Megalomania. They were well known for their humorous small characters, quirky pop video intros and clean, precise and imaginative gameplay. However, although they became masters of the 2D graphics machines, their transition into the 3D era was less successful. And after spending considerable time and effort on their groundbreaking game, Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, which they initially signed to Warner Interactive Entertainment, they found the very political hot potato of a game too near to the knuckle for Warner's purchasers, GT Software, and were subsequently unable to sell it on to any publishers in the pre-GTA days of 1998. And in 1999, Jon and Chris sold Sensible Software to Codemasters, one of the top game publishers in the UK, for an undisclosed sum. So, for this video, I thought it would be good to cover the history and all the games of Sensible Software. So, let's go back to the start of the story where Jon and Chris met. Both Jon Hare, also known as Jovial Jops, and Chris Yates, also known as Cuddly Krix, were at Great Baddow School together in Chelmsford, Essex, where they both knew each other from their 5th year of school. Now, Jon Hare had been fascinated by music since childhood. He played the guitar very well, composed his own songs and wrote lyrics. And when he was 15 years old, well, that's when he met Chris, and they were united by their love of music and performances in the same amateur bands. Together they played in a number of bands and formed a group called Zeus. Chris played rhythm guitar and Jon sang and played lead guitar. They were playing 70s rock, Pink Floyd type of music. And as I recall, they also formed a band called Touchstone, where they played around the Essex area. After about a year of acquaintance, however, there was a breakup. Jon began to study art and theatre, and Chris computer science. However, none of them stayed in school for too long. Chris dropped out after only 3 months, and Jon lasted a year in his major. As they recall, they did not drop out of school because of bad grades, but because of the boredom that overwhelmed them during lectures. And when they left college at 19, well, the guys tried various odd jobs, but their main occupation was still developing their musical band. And since Chris's father worked abroad and his football brother was often away, well, Chris's apartment was ideal for music rehearsals. And at the same time, well, Chris was trying to learn programming on his ZX Spectrum. Chris taught himself to program. He was pretty good actually, while Jon was a bit more of an art type person. And for fun, well, he and Jon programmed simple, bizarre, humorous games. And after a few months, he felt confident enough to respond to an ad in a local newspaper. LT Software was looking for a programmer. After getting the job, Chris was given his first task to write a game called Sodov the Sorcerer. It was supposed to be a simple shooter in which you control a wizard standing on the defensive wall of a castle, fighting off legions of dragons. Chris quickly wrote the code, but he did struggle to create the graphics for the game and asked Jon for his help. And Jon, well, he certainly coped with the task in a very short time. And when the owners of the company found out about the participation of Chris's colleague, well, they offered him a job as a graphic designer, which Jon accepted without hesitation. I suppose it's an okay game. It's not brilliant, but this was their first attempt at making a game, and for that, it's pretty good. Now, over 9 months at LT Software, they'd done a number of games, particularly for System 3. Jon worked on a game called Flyer Fox. Now, this game is a shooter seen from the cockpit's perspective of the Flyer Fox. Each level begins with an automatic takeoff, so the Fox finds itself behind the airliner to protect. Soon, enemy fighters will appear and must be shot down with the Fox's guns to keep the jumbo from harm. Cockpit instrumentation includes a radar, a compass and an artificial horizon to be used to locate any enemies and also to find one's way back to the protected plane. There is also a status line that displays the current damage level of the airliner. If either the jumbo is shot down or the Fox's fuel runs out before all enemies are shot down, it's game over. In later levels, the difficulty increases, with the enemy planes being more agile and actually shooting back. The game's okay, that's all I'd say about it, but I suppose the game did feature synthesized speech used for radio messages from the airliner. Jon also worked on an early version of International Karate, but it got binned after the lead programmer left. Wow, that must have been a little bit frustrating. And they also worked on a version of Trivial Pursuit. However, their first big game that both Jon and Chris worked on together was Twister, also known as Twister Mother of Charlotte, or just Mother of Charlotte, which is a shooting game. And Twister was commissioned by LT Software for System 3 for the ZX Spectrum in 1986. It was originally developed as Mother of Harlots, but was renamed after a controversy regarding the title and sexualised promotion from skimpy dressed dancers at an industry event. And there was also a planned Commodore 64 version, but that was never released. And what's this game about? Well, the evil Twister has a plan to ruin humanity, and only you can stop her. This involves travelling through your inner thoughts to gather the required symbols. The first level is platform based and scrolls into the screen with platforms arranged as with the grid in hopscotch, with one in the middle followed by one to either the left and right, then another in the middle. You must collect crystals as well as packs of 8 shots, you start off with 20, while shooting as many of Charlotte's minions as you can. On the second level, you must collect ultimate power by collecting each of those 13 levels from a 3D room with full floor and ceiling interaction by quickly swapping between the two surfaces, shooting and avoiding enemies in the process. On level 4, there's a rocket launcher allowing you to move around the whole screen. Eventually, you must face down and shoot the Twister in the throat to kill her. Now, the game received positive reviews from Crash, Sinclair User and Your Sinclair. For me, it's a strange, but I suppose it's quite a fun game to play. Now, the boys only worked for LT Software for a number of months, but during that time they learned a lot about the capabilities of computers, and after making Twister for System 3, they realised that they were only getting 15% of the money. And it was at that point they wanted to become independent. They thought at least rather than get ripped off by middlemen, they would get ripped off a bit less in their own company. And it was thanks to Thatcher's policy of support for business creation that these two hippies were able to found their own company. Though they still needed £1,000 each to be eligible and therefore accepted a final order from LT Software, a port of Runestone that was never released. And I'll come on to that game in a second. So they were then able to create their studio Sensible Software in 1986. Although until 1987 they continued to develop their games in a spare room in Chris's house. Music still remained their priority at that time because they had no idea that Sensible Software would be so successful. Anyway, let's go back to that game Runestone that we mentioned earlier on. The first work for the official Sensi came from Firebird to convert Runestone to the Commodore 64, an early graphic adventure game which got a release by Firebird on its hot range back in 1985 on the ZX Spectrum. But unfortunately, the Commodore 64 game would never see the light of day. So what was this game actually about? Well, the original ZX Spectrum game was coded by Alan Davis and produced by the Games Workshop. The game features a technique called Venture Scope, which combined real-time action, a full-text interpreter, multiple command input, dozens of independent characters, and 8,000 views from over 2,000 locations. Now, Chris and Jon's conversion was completed in around just 2 weeks, but sadly, Firebird complained that the game was playing too slow. In the end, the game never got released as a result of this, and both Jon and Chris were never paid either. Ouch, must have been frustrating. Now, the next game that both Jon and Chris worked on was actually a budget game. Galaxy Birds is basically a unique reworking of Galaxians. And the game was released by Firebird in August 1986. And in this Galaxian-style shooter, players control a ship who must dodge wave upon wave of birds such as vultures, chickens, swans and budgies. Ships can move left or right and fire 2 shots at a time. And in each wave, birds fly into players in a kamikaze attempt to destroy your ship. And players proceed to the next wave when all birds in the current have been killed. Lives are lost when birds make contact with their ship, and the game ends when all lives have been lost. Now, in the Zap review, Julian Rignall said, "To be honest, this game is a load of rubbish, but it is enjoyable rubbish. Graphics are poor, sound is awful, but I love it." Amazingly, Sensei jumped straight from Galaxy Birds to Parallax. And this game was named after its primary graphical feature, parallax scrolling, which gives the illusion of depth to the side-scrolling video game. Now, Sensei contacted Ocean Software, then the biggest English publisher, and managed to convince them on the first try. But I have to say the deal won't be so good in hindsight because they didn't receive any royalties. Both Chris and Jon were 19 years old at the time, and it was Chris that came up with the initial concept of the shoot-'em-up game where players could fly above and below the platforms. And it was Jon who designed the levels and the graphics, with Chris adding additional effects such as sliding walls. The puzzle elements were planned to be more complex, but the Commodore 64's limited memory didn't allow it. And the ending of the game, which simply outputs system off, was all they could fit in the remaining memory. The game also marks the studio's first collaboration with Martin Galway, nephew of the famous flutist Sir James Galway. And Martin created the sound of the Ocean games at the time. The game score was inspired by Jean-Michel Jarre's album Rendezvous, which Martin had been listening to during development. In the game, it has a 11-minute music introduction. Wow, 11 minutes. Now, in essence, Parallax is a top-view, multi-directional scrolling shoot-'em-up. Improved weaponry and shield recharges can be bought by the machine. You can also duck under the layers of the surface, but so can the aliens, so action can take place here. I have to say, ducking under the layers was a neat touch. And you can also get out of your ship and patrol the area on foot. 6 Months of Toll was rewarded with its release in October of '86 for the Commodore 64. And it was released by Ocean Software in Europe and Mindscape in North America. On release, reviews praised the game's mix of traditional side-scrolling action and adventure game-inspired puzzles. Parallax does get good reviews, but it is difficult to know if it sold well in the absence of any royalties. So, there you go, that was Parallax. Okay, now we're on for the next game, Wizball. Now, at the time, both Jon and Chris were not yet aware of the drawbacks of their deal with Ocean Software. They just wanted to stick with a publisher who supports them, which at the time was almost as important as the money. And when Jon met his future wife Irene, who worked in the department that pays royalties at Firebird, she helped him to write a letter to Ocean to review their contract, but to no avail. Jon would have certainly learned a lesson here. Developing games is not just limited to the creative part. You also need to know at least one person from the compatibility department of each publisher you work with. But anyway, they stuck with Ocean and developed Wizball, which is a scrolling shooter inspired by Gradius, with an additional collection dynamic. It is a horizontally scrolling game taking place over 8 levels, which involves navigating around a landscape and shooting at sprites. However, the aim of the game is to collect droplets of coloured paint to colour the level. Each level starts off as a monochromatic drawn in 3 shades of grey and needs 3 colours, red, blue and green, to be collected to complete it. The player, a wizard who's taken the form of a green ball, can navigate between the levels through portals. Initially, the wizard only has access to the first 3 levels, but completing levels gains access to further levels. Each level has bouncing spheres of different colours, and shooting them releases droplets, which may be collected. Each level needs a different colour to be added, which can be composed by collecting enough quantities of the correct colour. On later levels, the spheres of paint start shooting bullets, adding to the challenge. The wizard himself cannot collect paint droplets and is initially only capable of very limited movement. The wizard bounces up and down at a fixed rate, with the player only controlling the speed of rotation and thus how fast it will move horizontally after touching the ground. Collecting pearls, which appear with certain types of enemies that have been shot, gives the player tokens that can be used to buy enhancements such as greater control over movement and improved firepower. It also allows the option to summon the companion known as a Catalite. And this Catalite is the wizard's cat, and it's also spherical in form, normally following the wizard, but it can also be moved independently by holding down the fire button whilst moving the joystick. But if you do that, well, this renders the wizard uncontrollable. Only Catalite is capable of collecting paint droplets, and the player has to use it to do so. In the 2-player co-op mode, Catalite is controlled by the second player. Now, the music in this Commodore 64 version was again composed by Martin Galway, with input from Jon and Chris also. And the Commodore 64 version, well, that's the original by Sensible Software, and it was released in 1987, and later in the year for the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC. Versions for the Amiga and the Atari ST were ported by Peter Johnson and released in the following year. And there was also a port for the IBM PC. The game has been heralded as one of the best ever original games to appear on the Commodore 64. It is noted for its originality and use of the C64 hardware via graphics, sound and general presentation. The control method has been described as innovative, initially awkward, but adding to the playability when mastered. The readers of Retro Gamer in 2011 selected it as the second best game ever made for the platform. Quite possibly one of the most beautifully crafted Commodore 64 games that you'll ever have the privilege to play. The game was also awarded a Sizzler Award in the July 1987 issue of Zap 64 magazine with a rating of 96%, just missing out on a gold medal. And in November the following year, Wizball was selected by the same magazine, the number 1 shoot 'em up for the Commodore 64, giving it a rating of 98%. And a month later, it went on to be crowned the best game ever by Zap 64, which Jon Hare has stated is one of his proudest career moments. And lastly, Commodore Force ranked the game at number 15 on its list of the top 100 Commodore 64 games. So, this game was a massive hit for Sensei, and it certainly put them on the map. Now, Sensei's next concept never actually came to fruition, and that game was called The Day the Universe Died. Sensible Software decided to take a trip into the world of 3D games with an ambitious Elite-style space trading game. The game was to be in the same style as Elite, taking over various space stations to help create a new universe, which was destroyed after a huge war. Most notable about Sensible Software's promising game was the inclusion of fast-filled 3D vector graphics. This is something which had not really been done on the Commodore 64 before at that point in time. A sneak preview rolling demo of all the ships and descriptions were released to readers of Zap 64 on their first ever cover tape, the Zap Sampler. This was certainly an advert for a big game, which Sensible were hoping to create with the hope that a publisher would see and want to sign it up. But that never happened. Okay, next game. Right, now so here's a game of making games. Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit is a game creation system created by Sensei and published by Outlaw in 1987. It allows the user to make simpler shoot 'em ups by drawing sprites and backgrounds and editing attack patterns. Whilst it's not the first software of its kind, Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit remains a simple and effective way to create a vertical shoot 'em up. Initially, Chris created it to allow Jon to work on his level design and attack patterns on his own. And Jon developed 4 games with it: Slap and Tickle, which is inspired by Slap Fight; Outlaw, a Wild West shoot 'em up in the style of the arcade game Commando; Transputer Man, set inside a computer and partially inspired by the arcade game Robotron 2084. And finally, Celebrity Squares, featuring graphics drawn by several Commodore 64 personalities, including video game journalists Gary Liddon and Gary Penn. Next up is Oh No, a new low-budget order from Firebird. This time it's a clone of Rip-Off that experienced the same commercial failure as Galaxy Birds. However, it was developed with the Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit. Oh No is a fast-paced shoot 'em up with multi-directional scrolling. Taking place in the far, far future, you'll take the role of an ox breeder. Using your ship Bad Jack, your objective is to prevent aliens from taking away your oxes. To your disposal, you have 2 kinds of weapons: a laser and a boomerang weapon shot from the rear. You can get a new ox if you destroy one of the ox parents, occasionally appearing on the playfield. There's 8 worlds in the game, and to complete a world, you need to defeat 9 alien waves, and the game is lost when all oxes have been taken away. The Snake Charmer of the High Score table is a tribute to Master of the Lamps, a 1985 psychedelic title signed by Activision on the Commodore 64. And interestingly, the original MSX version was originally sold under the name Oh Shit, but the name was changed for the UK release. Sensei's next game was Microprose Soccer. Now, one of their favourite games at the time was A.K.A. World Cup in the arcade, which was developed by the future Tecmo. In this game, well, it uses a top-down view and is controlled with a trackball, but it is above all the vertical scrolling, quite unprecedented, that marks them. You feel less like a spectator and more in the shoes of the players. So Sensei prepared a solid demo that they presented to various publishers and opted for the highest bidder, Microprose, which offered them an advance of £30,000. And I suppose that was quite a lot of money back then. And also in June 1988, a full development, the duo became a trio with the arrival of Martin Galway. Yes, that's right, Martin. He left Ocean in October 1987 and was about to leave for the United States to work at Origin Systems when the duo dissuaded him. They wanted to hire him as an employee, but he wanted to be a partner. And it is only later that he discovers that he must share the debt of the other 2 who have bought beautiful cars at the time. But before signing the contract, he composed the music for the game, one of his last for Sensible Software since he joined the studio as a programmer. Although the cover suggested a football simulator in a traditional style, it was actually a very humorous game with an incredible load of playability. And despite its lax approach to the subject, this is one of the best football games on the Commodore 64. And the game was also ported over to other systems, and in the United States the game was released as Keith Van Aeron's Pro Soccer, named after Keith Van Aeron. Now, Hare cited the arcade video game A.K.A. World Cup as the basis and the inspiration for the game. He referred it to as an arcade conversion of the A.K.A. World Cup, but said it was not a carbon copy, as they also added their own elements to the gameplay. And as I've already mentioned, A.K.A. World Cup used a trackball to control the direction and speed of the shot, which they also incorporated into the game by adapting the game physics for more conventional joystick controls. The game can simulate an 11-a-side game of football on a grass pitch, or a 6-a-side soccer game based on the American Indoor League of the time. The indoor game has US soccer teams and plays on a much smaller field, and it has different rules compared to outdoor soccer. So I suppose it was obvious they were trying to get into the American market at this particular time. The control method was designed to be as simple as possible, lending itself to fast and flowing football, similar in manner to the later Sensible Soccer. Although, it's nowhere near as good as Sensible Soccer, and we'll come on to that game soon. Most unusual was the banana kick, the strength of which could be varied among 3 settings in the options menu. By pushing diagonally as a shot was taken, the ball would swerve in the air to get round defenders and goalkeeper. The same movements and shots can be made, sometimes with even funnier effects. Example, the banana shot bouncing off the ball and then into the goal. And I also believe Rival Game Kickoff would also add this feature to their game too. Most versions featured a simulated action replay after a goal was scored, with the Commodore 64 version featuring black and white stripes to resemble a video rewinding. And I love these little features that Sensei added to their games. And it's fair to say that Microprose Soccer was certainly the basis and inspiration for the future Sensible Soccer series. And finally, the title, well, it proved to be a huge critical success. The Computer and Video Games magazine writes that it is the best sports game of all machines. And as a result, the game was top of the charts, but the Duo, they still didn't get much royalties. Also, Crash gave a positive review and they gave the game 90%. And the game, well, it was voted Best 8-Bit Simulation of the Year at the Golden Joystick Awards. In the Spectrum sales charts, it briefly reached the #1 position before being replaced by Kenny Dalglish Soccer Manager. And in the All Formats chart, the game was kept off the top position by Robocop, which had been at #1 for a record 18 weeks. Have to say I've got fond memories playing Robocop, and I've done a whole video on all the Robocop game series if you're interested. Okay, we're on to another unreleased game, and this game now is called Touchstone. In October 1988, when Microprose Soccer was nearing completion, the studio embarked on an unprecedented project. Bearing the then name of their band Touchstone, it is the first game on a new medium, the first published by an American company also called Origin Systems, and the first to be entirely designed on paper, so without starting with a hack by Chris. Designed by John and Martin, the game starts on the Commodore 64, with Martin Galway strangely being the main coder while Chris Yates got on with other projects. Now things, as a result, were slow as Martin was not a prolific games programmer. The platform kept changing too. Started on the Commodore 64, the game was moved from the Commodore 64 to the Amiga and then to the PC platform. It certainly seems that they weren't setting themselves up for success. For 2 years they'd been working on the gameplay and story for Touchstone, a kind of traditional storyline fantasy role-playing game but with a twist in it. The game became so big and very intricate. They originally wanted the player to be able to approach the game through one of the many plots and subplots. A very long period of time was spent on the game, but it's believed that very little Commodore 64 code was actually produced and a lot more time was spent on storyboarding and also the Amiga version. And when Palace Software came along and offered him a generous advance for a tennis game, well, Martin was entrusted with the SD port and abandoned all work on Touchstone. Unfortunately, no version was ever to get a release. So much time was spent on the game and no end product was forming that in the end, Origin decided to pull the plug on the actual project. Origin decided that the American market that it was primarily aimed at was changing towards the Nintendo consoles. There was no deadline as such, but admittedly they weren't making much progress. Luckily, Origin were good to work with, and it was an amicable decision to stop the project in November 1989. The project is now dead, but Sensei still hold the copyright. The game is something of a well-remembered title for the Sensible Software guys. It took up a large part of their lives and believed that the game had massive potential. For me, that's a shame. I would love to have seen that game. Anyway, at the time, rents were high and the studio had difficulty affording its first real office above a florist in Cambridgeshire, where they completed Microprose Soccer. They stayed there for only a year and then moved to another place at Station Approach, and it was at that point that they parted ways with Martin, who had a hard time getting into pure programming. For me, it's crazy that they actually put Martin onto programming. His skill was music, doing the soundtracks for the game. He's not a programmer. Don't know why they've done that. Again, just wasting time, not setting themselves up for success. Right yo, now we're on to the next game from Sensei, and this time we have Blood and Bullets, which was created in 1989. This game was also given away with a special version of Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit, distributed with CU Amiga magazine. This is kind of similar to Commando, where you have to shoot soldiers, and even soldiers on motorcycles and motorbikes, in order to rack up plenty of points. There are also soldiers who walk around placing bombs in order to kill you, as well as tanks that fire rounds across the screen, and even the soldiers themselves move in all directions firing bullets at you, along with ones who pop out of the water and shoot before diving back underneath. At the end of the levels you have a static screen, and several enemies will come to pop you off if you're not quick enough to avoid the bullets. Plenty of pickups around too, which are shown as medals, and when picked up add to your score in the bottom middle. Let's have a look at the game. The next game is Insects in Space, which is a shoot-'em-up game released in 1989 for the Commodore 64, the Amiga and the Atari ST. During the conception of Touchstone, and to bring in some money, Chris embarks on a Defender clone. But instead of a spaceship, this time we control a naked angel with bouncy boobs. Now this is Sensi's third and final low-budget game. It was also the last musical work of Martin Galway, who took a break from the development of Touchstone between December 1988 and February 1989 to compose what looks like a medley of his work. Anyway, back to our bouncy angel. So, insects killed everyone on Earth except a few babies. This causes the mystical leader of motherhood, St. Helen, to travel to Earth's remains and save the babies. And as I've already said, the most important feature of this protagonist is the fact that she is topless, and there's a prominent mention in the manual, big-breasted, but she controls and shoots just like the spaceship normally found in those games. The levels are side-scrolling, and St. Helen can move in both directions. Additionally, the levels are 2 screens high, the lower with a floor and the higher with a ceiling, which can be changed by leaving the current screen to the top respectively bottom. The babies are either positioned at the top or bottom level and are hunted by bees. Wow, this game's a bit bizarre, isn't it? And those babies pick them up, steal their life energy to create a new monster and drop them to the ground to die. So the player's job is to kill the bees and save the babies. To help, a raider shows where in the level a kidnapping is in progress. And the babies can either be returned to the ground for points or kept in Helen's grasp to convert them into power-ups. And also, Helen can also summon a dust cloud, which teleports her near a bee target. Now, the game actually got a good review in Zap64 with a score of 94%, and it even made the cover of the magazine. Sensi's next project was International 3D Tennis, which was actually published by Parallax Software for the Amiga, the Atari ST, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. This game marks a turning point, not so much for the 3D, but because it was their last game on the Commodore 64. It also marks an evolution from the point of view of recognition. The duo had already enjoyed critical or commercial success, but this time their work was finally rewarded financially with an unprecedented £35,000 advance from Parallax Software. So Chris dusted off his 3D engine from the day the universe died. The players are modelled using a few triangles and segments, and they're only male players. And that's because you can't tell the difference between a man or a female with these graphics. But above all, the game offers a lot of content, with a complete recreation of the tournament calendar and the exact amount of rewards and so on. As a sports fan, Jon likes to incorporate all this technical data, but also to recreate the psychology of tennis through the controls. Unlike the games of the time, the studio quickly decided that movement would be assisted to focus the gameplay on ball strike. And I suppose their only source of inspiration is Leaderboard, a golf game, but it was already in 3D and this was in 1986. That was 4 years before this game was released. David Korn was in charge of the two 16-bit ports from his dorm room, And this collaboration worked as he later joined the studio, which, as we know, had just recently separated from Martin Galway, and they desperately needed somebody to take care of the sound. The Commodore 64 version was almost devoid of them, but for the 16-bit versions, they also called on Richard Joseph, a very experienced composer who became their permanent collaborator. Now, looking back at the game today, it is very, very basic, but I guess this was the equivalent of virtual tennis back in its day. The game includes 10 camera angles, 1 or 2 players, 64 different computer opponents with 15 skill levels, 72 tournaments based on real events, and 4 court surfaces. You can choose 22 tournaments and play in a full tennis season. Other features of the game is also to learn to play topspin and backspin balls. 4 player ability levels, there's amateur, semi-pro, pro and ace. It also had the TV tennis theme tunes, and anytime save option, and of course, the game uses vector graphics, and that gives it a 3D look. Wow, 3D, that was the future. Critics were divided, but the game was quite successful, helped by the name of the now renowned studio. Jon admits to giving a lot of importance to criticism, especially at the time, because the need for recognition is as important, if not more, than financial security for an artist. Fortunately, the studio had excellent contact with the press and not hesitating to discuss for hours, providing demos and so on. In regards to these reviews, well, Amiga Format said that Pro Tennis Tour is the better game. International 3D Tennis is good, but the graphics let it down, and although it plays well, it does not play as well as Ubisoft's game. Computer and Video Games concluded, once mastered, International 3D Tennis offers the best tennis action you'll ever likely to experience off court. The games machine summarised, combining the innovative 3D with a variety of shots at hand and the sheer playability, International 3D Tennis is one of the best computer sports games ever, appealing to many more than just tennis players. And finally, yours Sinclair summed up, nice 3D gameplay, shame about the sluggish speed. So there you go, that was International 3D Tennis. Right, my personal favourite from Sensible Software, and that game is Megalomania. Work on Megalomania began in early 1990 after the departure of Martin Galway. The studio began to be successful but did not yet make much money. It had achieved the reputation of the best developer on the Commodore 64 in Europe, but a new challenge awaits it, the Amiga. Chris had just finished the Commodore 64 version of International 3D Tennis and started work on Whiz Kid, which forced the duo to hire contractually a consultant to code Megalomania, and that name was Chris Chipper Chapman. Wiser in parents and not knowing the studio, he will nevertheless prove to be crucial in its evolution. Despite the new medium of the Amiga, the game is actually not designed around the graphics. And the process of making the game, well, there was not much interaction between Jon and Chris, but Chipper does what is asked of him, and he does it well. Jon prepares the concept on paper and works extensively with temporary graphics to balance the design. And it was only after 4 or 5 months that they decided to present their game to Version, but they refused to take on the game. So, as a result, they turned to Mirrorsoft, who offered them an advance of £35,000. And Mirrorsoft, well, they had also taken on the Bitmap Brothers in their stable as well. And if you're interested in the Bitmap Brothers, well, my last video was all about the Bitmap Brothers, and I have to say, I spent hours making it, so check it out. Megalomania was originally conceived under the title Alien Empire, and later My Little Warhead, but these names were scrapped in lieu of the final title of Megalomania. The game's original concept had the player taking the role of an operator of a spaceship who needed to combat robots located on an island, with the island being split into 16 sections. However, it was then decided that the futuristic universe was to be replaced by cavemen under the influence of the Populous game. And I have to say, I liked Populous. It was a good game. I owned it on the Master System and played it for many hours. The game will have required a year and a half of work and a lot of exhausting overtime hours at the end, to the point of becoming sick. But the sad thing is that Megalomania was not the beginning of the great adventure dreamed of, as the studio had signed a contract with Microprose for 4 games, including a sequel, but also Sensible Soccer and Cannon Fodder, with advances of £33,000 and £40,000 respectively. The bartender of the pub where it was signed even served as a witness. However, 2 months after the game's release, on the 5th of November 1991, the body of millionaire publisher Robert Maxwell was found off the coast of Tenerife. And it was then discovered shortly afterwards that he was guilty of a vast fraud to bail out of the companies in his group, including Microsoft, and the advances were not paid and 75% of Megalomania's royalties went up in smoke. And it was certainly at this point that Jon began to take a serious interest in the business part. This misadventure would at least have taught them not to put all their eggs in one basket. Once the rights to Megalomania was recovered, they turned to Ubisoft for distribution, but the game had lost momentum and sales collapsed after a few months due to a lack of stock. But by the time it was reissued, the competition was tough, with the games such as Populous and Powermonger out there. But anyway, enough of the doom and gloom. Let's have a look at Megalomania. What is this game all about? Well, it's a real-time strategy where in the game the player takes control of one of 4 gods: Scarlet, who's red, Caesar, who's green, Oberon, who's yellow, and Madcap, who is blue. But I have to say, I didn't see any real differences between them except colour and perhaps a little bit of AI behaviour when opposing. Each level takes place on an island divided into 2 to 16 sectors. And your objective is really simple. You just need to defeat the other 3 opposing gods and conquer the island. Before a level begins, the player decides which sector to place their first tower in and how many men to deploy. The little men can perform various tasks such as designing weapons and shields, mining elements, building structures, manufacturing weapons, and forming an army. The number of men assigned to a single task determines how fast or effective it will be. And men that are left idle will procreate and gradually increase in number. And at the start of the level, the player only has unarmed men available. So to gain more powerful weaponry, the player must assign men to design technology. When enough designs are made, the sector will advance to a tech level, making more research and buildings available. Armies can be used to either invade enemy sectors or build a tower in an empty sector, expanding the player's territory. Shields are used to repair damaged buildings. Weapons and shields can only be made if enough elements can be gathered. And higher tech weapons and shields must be manufactured in the factory before use. And building a mine gives access to more elements, and the laboratory improves design tasks. And of course, if the sector's tower gets destroyed, the player loses control of that sector. And if the player has no sectors or men left, the level must be restarted. Absolutely love this game. Brilliant. Pure genius. Now, you also have the option to form an alliance with an opponent if there are 2 or 3 present on the map. An allied opponent will not attack the player, but also neither of them can expand their territory while both are allied. It is also important to mention that alliances cannot be made if only one opponent is remaining. There are 28 islands in the game which are named in alphabetical order, except the last 2, and grouped into 10 epochs. Each epoch contains 3 islands and represents a different era in time, starting from 95,000 BC and ending in 2001 AD. Conquering the 3 islands in any order will allow the player to proceed to the next epoch. And at the start of the game, the player receives 100 men in each epoch, and any unused are carried over to the next epoch. The only exception is at the 10th epoch, which contains only 1 Eponus island and does not grant extra men to the player. And when you eventually get to the year 2001, and provided you either have other settlements or an army deployed somewhere, you can send your peeps into suspended animation. And then you wake up on an island called Armageddon. And at the end of the game, you do battle with lasers with any opponents who have also packed their folks into cold sleep. Generally speaking, because the AI isn't great, the opposition are rubbish at doing this though. Now, Megalomania is considered to be the first real-time strategy game to also incorporate a technology tree and was met with universal acclaim on its original release. With funny opponents who are parodies of real-life leaders, charming graphics and sound, and simple but yet addictive gameplay, Megalomania is a good light strategy game that is perfect for those who are new to the genre. Strategy veterans, however, would scoff at the game's weak AI and perhaps look elsewhere for their fill. I have to say, for me, I loved this game. It was my first real-time strategy game, and I suppose from this I went on to Populous, Powermonger, and then I went on and evolved into the Command and Conquer games. But it all started with Megalomania, an absolute brilliant genius of a game.
The design is finished.
The production run's completed.
We've won!
Now, it's fair to say that Jon was a little bit bitter that his favourite game, Megalomania, was perhaps the least known game out of the software library. However, it's fair to say that the studio adapted and then grew following this bitter experience. In fact, this all marked the beginning of his best period, when he had half a dozen people, with the subsequent arrival of Julian Jameson and Stuart Cambridge, and this is in addition to Ubik and Chipper, to whom must be added Richard Joseph for audio and also Mike Hammond as a consultant on football games. It's the dream team, or rather the whole group, and it could have lasted forever if the Amiga had remained in fashion. And from there, the studio worked with the three largest publishers in Europe at the same time: Ocean, Virgin and Renegade. Things are just about to get interesting. And how does it get interesting? Well, Sensible Soccer is the answer to that question. This game was highly popular in the 1990s, and it still retains a cult following. Sensible Soccer is regarded by many as the best football game on the Amiga and is a masterclass in accessibility. The menus, gameplay and general presentation might feel minimalistic, but everything has a near perfect balance of both form and function. What is present here works exceptionally well. You get access to a ton of different game modes that include various leagues and cups and a huge roster of international teams with accurate player rosters. There are two versions of the original game which were released with additional features, but for me the original first game still contains more than enough football action for even the most ardent fan. When you watch a real football match on TV, you'll observe players passing the ball to other players on their team whilst trying to create openings to line up shots on the opposing team's goal. This often fails to translate to video games because the scale of the graphics and camera distance means that you can't see who you're passing to, or the mechanics simply punt the ball in the direction the player was pushing on the joystick at the time. Sensible Soccer nails the concept of passing by scaling the pitch and player graphics such that you have an excellent view of everything going on around the ball. Not only can you see available players to pass to, the player in possession of the ball will instigate a pass directly to the nearest teammate, provided you were aiming in the general direction. And the passing system is just one aspect of the brilliantly designed control system. The standard joystick used by most players had only a single fire button, but Sensible sidestepped this limitation by having the type and strength of kick determined by how long you hold the button down. A quick tap initiates a pass or low ball upfield if no one is nearby, while holding down the button will blast the ball forward. It's also possible to curve or lob the ball using the brilliant aftertouch mechanic by pulling left, right or down on the joystick just as the ball leaves the player's feet. The window of opportunity for applying aftertouch is limited, but it becomes second nature with practice. The only improvement I would make to the controls is to have the ball stick to the feet of the player in possession more consistently. But that's just me, it's just a minor observation. What can I say about Sensible Soccer? It's just a brilliant game. It's certainly one of my favourite early football games of all time. The single player game is good enough thanks to a reasonably adept CPU player, but where this really shines is couch co-op with friends. This is a stonkingly good game, one bettered only by its own sequel, Sensible World of Soccer, and we'll come on to that game soon because it is absolutely classic. And there was also an additional game released for the Euros, which was Sensible Soccer European Champions. And bizarrely, this game features a track by Captain Sensible. And apparently, he was the one who approached the studio and offered to do it for free, but he never signed the contract established by Jon Hare. And guess what? 3 months after the release of the game, his record company demanded 10% of the profits. The studio complied, but removed the music from the following versions. Don't know why they used Captain Sensible, it must be the name Sensible, but he was absolute pish, that guy. I hated his songs. Now, because of the balance between position and fun, the title became the studio's first big hit, or at least the first to make a lot of money. And deservedly so, they received royalties right up until 1999, and the series exceeded 2 million units. Wow, that's an impressive figure for the time. And the game also topped charts, such as Amiga Power's all-time top 100. It was a brilliant game. Absolutely loved this game, still do. If we haven't mentioned Chris Yates since International 3D Tennis, it's because he later became technical director and supervised the other programmers. But less inclined than Jon to give orders, he tends to isolate himself and works on Whiz Kid as the lead programmer. The last project carried out from start to finish by the original duo, this sequel to Wizball logically becomes the most quintessential game of the developers. Until 1990, Wizball proved to be the studio's only franchise. But, not being a commercial success, Gary Bracey of Ocean had to fight to convince his superiors. He himself did not immediately grasp the concept, even after the first demo. And with the growing popularity of the Amiga compared to consoles, financing such a concept is damn risky. Now, this sequel certainly deviates from the original in many ways. The Wiz and his cat Nifta have successfully restored colours to the world. Both of them got married, though most probably not to each other, and had children. The Wiz had a son, Whiz Kid, and Nifta had 8 kittens. And their peaceful life ended when the evil mouse magician Zark kidnapped the Wiz, Nifta, and all the kittens, imprisoned them in different parts of the world. So, Whiz Kid must venture into unknown realms and rescue his father together with the feline family. Now, unlike Wizball, the screen does not scroll and Whiz Kid does not bounce around like his predecessor. The player has full control over Whiz Kid and his movements. He has to move around the screen bashing into bricks so that flying bricks collide with the on-screen enemies. And these bricks, they come in different shapes and sizes. Once the screen is cleared of all the enemies, coins are dropped, which must be picked up quickly before they disappear, and the player proceeds to the next screen. Killing multiple enemies with a single brick releases a bubble, which will sometimes offer a noise or teeth, but more often they turn into coloured notes. And these must be combined to form tunes, as patterned at the top of the screen. Once the player completes a tune, you are then taken to a shop, where you can buy items needed to progress to the next stage. If Whiz Kid has bashed all the bricks on the screen but failed to remove all the enemies, the player may be taken to a puzzle screen where he must solve Crossword 2091 for bonus money. The player has a number of words to put on the screen, but they must all overlap each other and use each other's letters. And each move has a time limit. If the player fails to complete the puzzle, he is taken back to the level. When exiting a shop, the player can choose either to exit as a head or a body, which is Whiz Kid with arms and legs. Assembled in this way, Whiz Kid is now limited by gravity and can jump around and use on-screen objects such as ringing bells or cranking wheels. He may also come across interactive elements which he will need to use with items in his pockets. And in the game, most of the levels require the player to solve inventory-based puzzles. Now, one of the highlights of Whiz Kid is the music by Richard Joseph, although the credits, which end with a spectacular explosion of Whiz Kid's head, are a cover of Tchaikovsky. Jon also prides himself in the game's build. Each level has 3 exits leading to as many levels. But you have to go through them all in the right order, without forgetting the crystals to open Nifta's cage. And to see the ending cinematic that contains a bold twist for the time, you still have to face Zark in a game of Wizardoids, a clone of asteroids. And aware that brick-breaking phases can be a bit boring, the duo adds crossword games like Crossword 2091 and homage to Robotron 2084. Whiz Kid may seem illogical, but he responds to a dreamlike and initiative logic. For example, jumping on the crank of a well makes a bucket appear, blowing into a condom allows you to float with this improvised balloon, and farting above the toilet triggers the eruption of a volcano and unclogs the entrance. Wow, I certainly think they were taking drugs when they made this game. But it is fair to say that at this point in their careers, they know what works and can let their imaginations run wild once the foundation is solid. There were certainly delays with this game, but what caused the delays were the parallel projects and the detailed creation of each level. But at the time, the games were contractually funded and it didn't cost Ocean more to wait. Sadly, the game was a failure when it was released in the summer of 1992. This was perhaps no surprise to both Gary Bracey and Jon. I mean, this type of game is unsellable for a publisher specialising in licensed games, and the cover doesn't help either. But, saying all that, the press loved it, and it became a cult film. And in November 1992, the studio won the Developer of the Year award at the annual Indian ceremony, the most prestigious in the video game industry at the time. However, with this recognition and the money earned by Sensible Soccer, it's fair to say the studio has never been in a better shape. After a trio of low-budget games on 8-bit machines, Sensible Software made a few cover discs on 16-bit, floppy disks, and they were offered with magazines, and they usually contained one or more small games. And with the Sensible style, it often felt that these games were like jokes. So let's have a look at these games. Let's have a first look at the first cover disc, starting with Sim Brick, which was released with the Amiga Power issue 13, May 1992. And in this authentic brick simulator, the goal is to crush ants. Quite simple really. Let's have a look. Next up is a shoot-'em-up construction kit game called Slap and Tickle, which was given away with a special version of Shoot-'em-up construction kit distributed with the CU Amiga magazine. In this vertically shoot-'em-up, you are a red spaceship flying throughout the worlds, and you have plenty of firepower to take down everything what moves. As with all shooters, shoot anything that moves, from pulsating orbs to round spinning objects, and avoid the gunfire and bullets, and have a blast. I suppose it's not a bad game. Okay, I like this one. And Sensible Soccer appeared on the Amiga Action cover disc of issue 42, which was March 1993. And in this game, you're playing as apples and oranges. Yes, apples and oranges playing football. Great fun. For me, this was a great little giveaway, and for a while, I played it as much as Sensible Soccer. For me, it made a change playing with fruit rather than the football players. It's a good game, I enjoyed it. On the Amiga Power cover disc 21, one of the demos was Sensible Soccer meets Bulldog Blighty. It's basically a homage to the famous Christmas time football match between the Germans and the British over No Man's Land in 1914. Quite a famous story. It featured a mode of play that involved replacing players with soldiers from Cannon Fodder and the ball with a hand grenade. And this flipping grenade, well, it would randomly begin to flash and would eventually explode after a few minutes, killing any nearby players. The game match itself was also played in black and white. Then, in 1993, via the Renegade software label, Sensible Software publishes Sensible Soccer European Champions 92-93 edition on the Amiga CD32, the Atari ST and the MS-DOS. With the original Sensible Soccer having sold hugely, this updated version was released some months later. The teams are updated with the sides present in the 92-93 European tournaments included, and the players' names updated to take transfers into account. This game was tidied up and changed in a number of areas. The most significant change is the addition of red and yellow cards for discipline. And also, the goalkeepers have been improved in skill, and the 1994 World Cup qualifying tournament was also added. Minor but nice touches nevertheless. Alright, now on to Cannon Fodder, which is the brilliant 1993 military-themed shoot-'em-up game published by Virgin Interactive Entertainment for the Amiga. And then, later on, Virgin ported the game to the MS-DOS, the Atari ST, Acorn Archimedes, Atari Jaguar, Mega Drive, Super NES and the 3DO. And the game I owned was the Super Nintendo version. I played it for hours. With regards to the intro, John wrote the song that he performed with Richard Joseph, and he had the video directed by a television crew he met at Sensible Soccer. A first in the history of video games. Cannon Fodder has a darkly humorous tone, which commentators variously praised and condemned. Its creators intended to convey an anti-war message, which some reviewers recognised, but the Daily Star and a number of public figures didn't see it that way. The poppy flower in the artwork and also the introduction evokes the one of Armistice Day, also the game's release date. The Royal British Legion found the studio's approach disrespectful and then demanded £500 because the poppy was their registered mark. Now John did pay the £500, but he no longer buys poppies to celebrate November the 11th. In all fairness, I would say that £500 is worth a lot of poppies anyway. Thankfully, this bad publicity did not prevent the game from topping the English charts for 12 weeks and being one of the studio's best rated games, even if, like many of their titles, this popularity remained confined to Europe. It would have made sense for a football game, but John thinks it's a shame that Cannon Fodder didn't work in the United States. Other reviewers highly praised the game, which widely achieved scores of over 90% in the Amiga magazines. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it, Daily Star, and also you as well, the Royal British Legion, with your £500. What do they know?
Never been so much fun. 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 Go up to your brother, kill him with your gun, leave him lying in his uniform, dying in the sun.
Anyway, let's have a look at the game. So, in this military-themed action game, the player controls a small squad of up to a maximum of 6 soldiers, depending on the mission. These soldiers are armed with machine guns which kill enemy infantry with a single round. The player's troops are quite fragile, and while they possess superior firepower at the game's outset, the enemy infantry becomes more powerful as the game progresses. As well as foot soldiers, the antagonists include vehicles such as jeeps, tanks and helicopters, as well as missile-armed turrets. The player must also destroy buildings which spawn enemy soldiers. For these targets, which are invulnerable to machine gun fire, the player must utilise secondary, explosive weaponry such as grenades and rockets. Now, the ammunition for these weapons is limited, and the player must find supply crates to replenish their troops. Wasting these weapons can potentially result in the player not having enough to fulfill the mission objectives. And I did like it when the player could shoot crates, destroying enemy troops and buildings in the ensuing explosion, at less risk to their own soldiers than retrieving them, but again, at a greater risk of depleting ammunition. And in the game, the player proceeds through 24 missions, divided into several levels, each making 72 levels in all. There are various settings including jungle, snow and desert, some with unique terrain features and vehicles such as igloos and snowmobiles. And the player must also contend with rivers and quicksand, as well as mines and other booby traps. I remember quicksand being very popular in the movies I saw as a kid in the 80s and 90s. Today, you never see quicksand in a movie. Anyway, in addition to shooting action, the game features strategy elements and employs a point-and-click control system, perhaps more common in strategy than action games. As the player's troops are heavily outnumbered and easily killed, they must use caution, as well as careful planning and positioning. To this end, they can split the squad into smaller units to take up separate positions or risk fewer soldiers when moving into dangerous areas. The designers also named each of the game's several hundred otherwise identical protagonists, who are also awarded gravestones, and these were displayed on a screen between levels. Of this personalisation, Hare said the graves show that people died, and their names meant that they're not just faceless sacrifices. The theme was certainly a departure from Sensible Software's usually non-violent games. The production of Cannon Fodder began in early 1991, but was then delayed as programmer Jules Jameson worked on Mega Drive conversions of other games. The proposed Cannon Fodder had been part of a 4-part deal with Robert Maxwell's software publisher, which we already discussed was liquidated after his death. Unusually for an independent developer, Sensible had little difficulty in finding publishers, and after work resumed on the game, concluded a deal with Virgin in May 1993. The creators chose Virgin as it seemed like a good bet, as well as because of the straightforwardness of UK head Tim Chaney. And several months before its release, elements of the game were combined with Sensible Soccer to create Sensible Soccer meets Bulldog Blighty, which we've just seen. Now for me, I did like Cannon Fodder. I did play it for many hours as I mentioned on my Super Nintendo, but I have to say I was a much bigger fan of Sensible Soccer and an even bigger fan of Megalomania. But of course that's just my opinion. But nevertheless, it's still a very good game. Next up is Cannon Soccer. Sensible Soccer nailed it with a stroke of pure genius, our favourite war shooter combined with arguably the best football game ever made. This demo was a Christmas cover disc on the 1994 copy of the Amiga Format magazine. It featured just 2 levels, Land of Hope and Glory, and It's Snow Time. The game is essentially 2 extra levels for Cannon Fodder, and did not get released as a title in its own right. Both of these levels are a little bit more tricky than I remember from the original title, mainly due to that effing helicopter. Let's have a look at the game. Next up is Sensible World of Moon Soccer, an amusing version of the highly popular Sensible Soccer game with 3,000 real players to choose from and real championships to play in, but this time with some difficult lunar playing fields. And this demo, well, it was featured on the Amiga Action 65 and it was disc number 2. Now we're on to Sensible Soccer International Edition. Released alongside the 1994 World Cup, this was the first version of Sensible Soccer to feature teams from outside Europe. The World Cup tournament is featured in full, and you can adjust which 24 teams this features, a particularly crucial feature for English and French fans, as their nations failed to qualify. And for the first time in the series, an on-screen referee is featured. Also, the club team data has been updated to take into account transfers and kit changes since the previous version. Apart from these changes, it plays exactly the same as the previous game. The time has come to reap the benefits of the work done. Renegade is clamouring for a sequel to Sensible Soccer, while Virgin wants a golf game and Cannon Fodder 2, for which the studio has an unprecedented advance, £150,000. Now, for the Cannon Fodder sequel, it's not a question of reinventing the wheel. Jon preferred to focus on the other two projects and entrusted the design of a game to someone else for the very first time, Stu Campbell, who joined the studio in June 1994 after working as a journalist for Amiga Power. Tired of the increasingly depressing atmosphere of the band Future, he gladly agreed to double his salary to work in one of the best English studios. As a result, Stu is hired and he cuts a good figure in front of Virgin to make sure that Cannon Fodder 2 is delivered on time. The basic gameplay remained the same: guide a team of soldiers through a succession of levels populated by trees, huts and lakes. However, there is a major change, and that change is that the plot involves time travel rather than straightforward war situations, and this means levels taking place in different scenarios, including a strange alien planet. The levels include a variety of vehicles such as jeeps, tanks and helicopters, which can be used to shoot or even run down enemy soldiers. Standard bullets are joined by collectible grenades and rockets. Use them wisely, as nothing else can destroy huts or vehicles. And of course, finding strategic defence positions can be vital as well. Now, the reviews for Cannon Fodder 2 were good, although a little bit more mixed. But the game was in the top sellers thanks to the fans of the original, and was able to break even. So it wasn't financially a success, it just broke even. And those Cannon Fodder 2 alien levels were also released with the Amiga Power issue 45. Alright, now for the big one. Sensible World of Soccer, which was released in 1994. Sensible Software launched Sensible World of Soccer a year after the release of Sensible Soccer and after its first update, with the goal of adding a management aspect. It's the logical next step, and anyway, they don't pay attention to the competition. Part of the code of the original is preserved, because if it isn't broken, then don't try fix it. On the other hand, the content is largely increased with 27,000 players, 1,500 teams and 70 countries. This is what made it at the time the most encyclopedic soccer game ever designed. It even takes into account the evolution of each team over the seasons, which is not without its problems. Perhaps the biggest difficulty was actually trying to finish the game in time for Christmas. In the end, the game was actually released with 60 big bugs, but it is good enough to be forgiven. And a patch was later provided free of charge with the One magazine in May. And with the experience of doing a video with Cannon Fodder, well, they decided to create an official music video that also served as the intro. As I recall, it was called Goal Scoring Superstar Hero. And Jon certainly has fond memories writing the song along with Richard Joseph. The title was obviously a great success. And the game was chosen among the 10 game Cannon games preserved at the Library of Congress in Washington. It is also the only sports game, the only one in Europe, and the most recent. The others being Space War, Star Raiders, Zork, Tetris, SimCity, Super Mario Bros. 3, Civilization, Doom and Warcraft. This was undoubtedly the biggest distinction received by the studio. For Hare, who thinks in long term, this is significantly more important than the last quarter's revenues, or even the money he has accumulated throughout his life. In addition, while Sensible Soccer was the first soccer game to feature players of colour, Jon is particularly proud that this sequel shows the universal side of soccer by featuring all the small local teams around the world. Sensible World of Soccer may not be their pinnacle artistically, but it's simply their best game. Until then, apart from the small bump in the road that was Cannon Fodder 2, the studio has been on the rise. The studio went through a first phase where they created popular games but didn't make any money, then a second phase where they started to be rewarded for their work. This second phase, unfortunately, is coming to an end, and once at the top, the studio can only go down. Well, at least they had time to deliver their masterpiece before the end of 2D. Anyway, let's have a look at the game. Virtually every important soccer league in the world is included in this game, with some countries not only having Premier, First Division, but Second, Third and more divisions. All important international competitions are included, club and national team based. The game has a career mode where you may play up to 20 seasons as a player manager or the manager only. And during a career as a coach, you're not tied down to one club or national team, meaning if you're good enough, one or more big clubs may make offers to you to coach their team. What can I say about this game? It's just simply brilliant. Now, Sensible World of Soccer was not the only football game released in 1994. They also released World Championship Soccer 2. In this game, well, it was released on the Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive as we like to call it here, and it is the sequel to World Championship Soccer. World Championship Soccer 2 is almost an entirely different game compared to its predecessor. Rather than play from an overhead perspective, the game opts for a sideways-on approach, and the pitch is notably smaller. There are more playable teams, but it is otherwise a very basic football game. The player can choose between many different worldwide football teams. And the game has many features common to soccer games of that time, including choices of automatic defence and attack formations and strategies. There are also a number of different gameplay options and tournaments that the player can be part of. And also, the game has the option to replay the games from the 1986 and 1990 World Championships. GamePro gave the game a mixed review. They praised the controls and the additional features not seen in the first game in this series, but said the soundtrack is weak and the graphics are almost identical to the originals. They concluded, though not among the elite soccer carts in terms of graphics and sounds, World Championship Soccer 2 is solid. It's an okay game, but by goodness, it does not compete against Sensible World of Soccer, because that game is just class. Now, 1995 also saw the release of Not Very Festive Fodder, which was originally included with the Amiga Format magazine issue number 68. And of course, the full version was released with Cannon Fodder 2, but with major modifications that separate the two shooter games, including the fact that this one is heavily Christmas themed. The next game is Sensible Golf, which is a 2D golf simulation, and I think this is where things start to get a little bit wobbly for Sensible Software. Anyway, at this particular time, Jon and Chris took up golf, and towards the end of Cannon Fodder's development, they thought that the latter's engine would make it easier to create a golf game and keep Julie and Jules Jameson available again. It would also consolidate the sensible look, that typical aerial view. But the game also needed to feature 4 players on screen who would brag and argue between shots. As fans of Leaderboard, the duo wanted a game that is advanced in terms of simulation without necessarily being the sensible soccer of golf. During the first 5 months, Jon was very involved in the development, but it was then that Jules, not without difficulty, finally delivered an engine that turned out to be well below expectations. And according to Jon, well, you could only animate one sprite on the screen at a time. And that is not what he had in mind, because as I said, he wanted 4 players on screen at a time. Now, Jon and Chris should have probably reacted at that particular time when they saw that, but this is happening precisely at a time when the studio has far too many projects in the works. Chris is immersed in his ports, and Jon at the time was focused on sensible World of Soccer while thinking about his next game, Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll. Now, this incident really did destroy Jon's motivation, especially since the game was supposed to be completed quickly and Virgin had paid a royal advance of £300,000. And I have to say, the stress got to Jules too. Jules was under so much pressure that he ended up with an ulcer. Dearie me. Now, for me, Sensible Golf is not necessarily a bad game, especially compared to the competition. So what's wrong with it? Well, it's just a bit bland and a little bit soulless. The biggest mistake was probably to use elements from the previous games, such as Cannon Fodder's engine and Sensible Soccer's menus, something that the studio had always wanted to implement. And I'm not too sure they should have done that. Now, I wouldn't say Sensible Golf is an accurate simulation of golf. It's more of an action adaptation of the sport, streamlined for quick and easy gameplay. But consequently, complications such as wind and terrain heights are not featured in the game, although the green has little arrows indicating the slopes. Apart from that, the players' only concerns are the water and sand hazards and the distance to the hole. As a result, Sensible Golf is instead a practice in target shooting rather than a golf game. With regards to the controls, well, striking involves only 2 actions, aiming the pointer in the desired direction and pressing the action button 3 times. The game uses the well-known 3-click control, with which you set power and swerve of the strike. The computer automatically suggests a proper club, but the player may change it manually, and a pop-up map helps one find their bearing. The courses are fictional, composed from a pool of holes, which often appear in multiple courses, sometimes with minor variations. And play modes include single 18-hole rounds, a complete season and a tournament. And up to 72 humans may participate in the latter. Sensible Golf was awarded the company's lowest ever score by a mega power of 66% and marked a sharp decline in the fortune of Sensible Software. It was also to be their last commercial Amiga release, with only Sensible Train Spotting to follow. We'll cover that in a moment. And also, at the end of the Amiga's life, its success was not incredible, especially since 2D was starting to be unpopular with the public. And I guess all the stress did get to Jules because he decided to leave the studio. Now, Stuart Cambridge, also known as Stu, remained proud of the result, but does confirm that the reuse of the engine was both the strong point of the game and also the reasons for its failure. What's more, he and Jules did not work in the same office at the time, which limited exchanges. And I guess the priority was then to finish the project, especially since Virgin was putting the pressure on. And as a result, there were lots of small details that they didn't have time to add, such as animals interacting with the ball. There was even a pervert opening his coat on the green if the player spends too much time preparing the shot. And the shadow of the clouds giving the direction of the wind. These were all the little details that would have made the game a lot better. "1995 also saw Sensible World of Soccer 95-96, which is the successor and improved version to Sensible World of Soccer. Chris Chapman said that this was the version they originally wanted to create. Besides updated team rosters, the most important additions are 2 new moves, curve passes with the after-touch system and stand-in headers. There was also updated representation of athlete statistics. Stars instead of numbers, each athlete has up to 3 specialist skills such as heading, shooting and finishing. There was also the ability to tag an athlete and reserve teams. Smaller optical changes include animated audience or some new animations after a goal is scored. And also, the active player's name is shown on the screen, and I like that too. "1995 also saw the release of Sensible Train Spotting. And this game, well, it was the last Amiga game and was only available on the Amiga Power Cover disc from issue number 53, dated September 1995. And because of this, it's not nearly as famous as some of the Sensible Software's early releases, such as Sensible Soccer and Cannon Fodder. Anyway, Sensible Train Spotting is the world's first ever computerised train spotting simulator. The game takes place at a railway station with a view looking over the train platforms. Various trains pass through, each bearing a unique ID number. At the bottom of the screen is a checklist of train ID numbers, each of which must be selected by the player as the corresponding train appears. This must be done against a time limit, and attempting to record an incorrect number will result in a penalty. And when all trains in the checklist have been spotted, the game moves on to the next level. Let's have a look. In time of the UEFA Euro 1996, the Sensible World of Soccer European Championship Edition was released. Gosh, I remember Euro 96. Remember that game between Scotland and England when Gaza scored that goal? What a game, and also what a goal. Even though I'm a Scotsman, it was a pretty good goal. Anyway, this version is equal to 95-96 edition, but included the actual European Championship as a preset competition with updated teams. This version was released for the PC as well for Amiga computers.
Oh, crash off the post! Here he is then with a throw. Oh, good goalkeeping!
And also released in 1996 was Sensible World of Soccer 96-97. And to most, this is perhaps the best and also the last instalment of the most popular soccer series. It was released for the Amiga with 2 floppy disks and also a PC as a CD-ROM. Now, this game is bursting with every feature you could ever want in a football manager sim. Sensible World of Soccer is brimming with 26,000 real-life players, each one with carefully researched statistics and abilities. There's 144 competitions from the local tournament all the way up to the European Cup final. There's also full career records and the unique scouting feature which allows you to track and observe a player's progress and evaluate their contribution to your team. And if management is not your style, then just dive into the action and play for your team. Such a great game. After Sensible World of Soccer development ended in 1996, some fan projects tried to keep Sensible World of Soccer up to date, like the Creswell brothers from England, who collected data from several internet forums and created an unofficial update to 97-98 for the Amiga. And also, during the 1998 World Cup in France, Gideon and Dom Creswell then made a special update which was based on 97-98 and contained also some new graphics. And this World Cup 98 update was officially supported by Sensible Software, and it was released on the CU Amiga CD number 24 in July 1998. But to use this update, a hard disk installation was required, which officially does not actually exist. Though Sensible had a strong presence on the 8-bit and 16-bit machines that dominated the late 1980s and early 90s, this success was not repeated on the 32-bit machines, such as the PlayStation, prominent in the mid-1990s. The trademark look of cute 2D characters had slipped out of vogue with the advent of cheap 3D rendering abilities, and games such as A.K.A. Soccer and FIFA turned to 3D, gradually shoving the Sensible Soccer series aside. So, Sensible Software, they put their minds to creating a 3D Sensible Soccer game, albeit they were a little bit late in doing this. And their first game was Sensible Soccer 98, which was made for the World Cup in 1998, and it can be played as both player and coach. The gameplay was supposed to be mostly the same as for the old games, but with the graphics being updated into 3D. And this should have been a risk-free project, but it ended up being a right burden for Sensible Software. While the first Sensible Soccer was developed in 9 months, this time they spent 3 years. In 2D, after a few days, even a few hours, you have an engine. While in 3D, it takes months and a lot of people to lay the foundations. If he had known, Jon probably would have done the graphics himself. But above all, in the end, the result seems to Jon to be one of no creative interest. I mean, to Jon, this episode doesn't offer anything new and even seems to be a bit of a throwback. But regardless, above it all, it showed Sensible Software that this was the end of an era. 2D was out and 3D was in. Now, at the time, they probably couldn't have done any better, even by hiring more people. And it's at a time when you can't find many people qualified for 3D anyway, and they often realised that their incompetence after hiring them. And as they got into developing the game, well, it was clear that 3D complicates everything. 90% of the development time is devoted to graphics and the use of motion capture, which was actually done by Jon and then by a professional footballer. It certainly gives a complete rethink of the gameplay. And Chris, while he knows nothing about it, he is assisted by programmers who will succeed each other to manage the 3D part of the code, and everyone naively hopes that the two halves of the code will magically merge. And processing the data retrieved from the motion capture sessions to make it usable was a complete nightmare. And sometimes you have to start all over again to ensure the link between the different activities. In the end, the game totally loses its charm on the graphic level, and it's all the more ridiculous that you only really enjoy the modelling during the replays. The gameplay then ended up losing a lot of speed, and it no longer ran at 60 frames per second. And on top of that, the rendering didn't seem to be that natural. They did try to move the camera away to hide the inaccuracies of contact with the ball and give the impression of playing the episodes in 2D. Faced with a choice between running the animations or running the gameplay, the studio quickly made its choice. Now for me, the game is not so bad in the end, taking in consideration the amount of difficulties they encountered. So let's take a look at what the game does actually have to offer. From the main screen, Sensible offers 3 different modes of what it calls arcade play, a single player instant match that picks 2 random international teams and gets the game started. Then there's Sensible International Challenge, in which the player jumps into a tournament against 20 progressively harder teams. And then there's head-to-head play, where players take on each other, sitting at the same computer. And for those who want more depth to their game, well, Sensible 98 offers 4 more advanced competition types. Friendly, in which the player selects any 2 teams and the computer take on one of the sides. Cup, which allows up to 64 teams to compete in a large tournament. And then there's League, which pits 24 teams after each other in a run of games. And Tournament, another 64 entry competition that contains elements of both Cup and League play. The tournament table is kept in an easy to read format, and players who are unfamiliar with the way these types of tournaments are run will find that they get the hang of it only after a few run-throughs. And for the hardcore fans, they will want to create their own teams with the game's amazingly thorough custom teams mode. From here, would-be coaches edit players, right down to their hair and skin, and create their own teams. Tactics can go to the coach's screen and select from a stunning number of different choices of exactly how the team is going to play. And coaches can even instruct individual players on tactics they want them to use during the game. And after everything's set just right, it's time to jump into the game itself. Okay, to put it simply, Sensible Soccer's on-field graphics and playability are amazingly outdated. FIFA Soccer not only looks better but controls better and more realistically on every single front compared to Sensible. Sure, it's great that players can affect the curve of their shots, but when was the last time you saw a player curve a shot to the left and then have it change direction in mid-air and start flying right? And in Sensible Soccer 98, well, this is a very real option. Now, I'll sum up a few problems that the players are likely to run into in their first 5 minutes of play. Firstly, team members won't pass the ball in a direction that they're looking in. And the characters on screen are so small that they're nearly invisible. And hitting the slide tackle button causes your man to go flying about 30 yards across the field. It's simply horrible, and no person who's ever played another soccer game will find any joy in the actual play aspects of this title at all. The truth is, if you want a really good fantasy league soccer title, then you really should check the game out. With that said, if you plan at any time to actually pick up and play with the teams you've created, get as far away from this title as you can. There are certainly far better ways to spend your time. Now, Sensible Soccer 98 disappeared for several months, only to finally reappear around the time of the 1998 World Cup under the new name, before undergoing a minor rebranding with the addition of club teams not long afterwards. And this is much to the anger of those who shelled out for the first game around. To honour its contract of 3 games, the studio was forced to duplicate its football game with a European Club Edition update, followed by a 3D equivalent of Sensible World of Soccer, bringing a management aspect. But towards the end, releasing these games is likely to cost more than it brings in, and the 3rd game is cancelled. And this would be Sensible's first time and the last that they have failed to fulfil an order. Anyway, Sensible Soccer European Club Edition is the follow-up sequel to Sensible Soccer 98. The game was released on Windows in 1997 and then on the PlayStation 1 in 1998. Like many remakes and modern updates, Sensible Soccer 98 European Club Edition came with a promise of blending modern features and presentation with a classic gameplay that fans know and love. But, true to form, after briefly convincing press and public, it was later dismissed as a shit cash-in that no one really liked. Ouch. Now, it retains the classic top-down view, but with the option of 3D replays and a simple control method, albeit with the inclusion of an additional button for pace, block tackle, alongside the main pass, shoot, slide, tackle button from previous games. The graphics don't make use of 3D acceleration, and time certainly hasn't been kind, with the replays highlighting boxy models and basic animation, although it's altogether more acceptable in the standard view. And out on the pitch, it's a curious affair. The main difference is that the ball now sticks to your player's feet. For the fans of the original games, this is possibly a deal breaker, removing much of the skill required to keep or run with the ball. However, for anyone frustrated by ping-pong nature of previous games, like me, it could be seen as a positive, at least allowing you to feel in control of the ball and pass it around. Now, I have to say, the ball physics are a bit odd too. At times, passes can run away from your players unexpectedly on the ground and hold up in the air, but it also seems as though adding some height is necessary to get any power behind your shots. Meanwhile, sliding tackles are launched from improbable distances and are rarely seen to be punished, despite an unhealthy proportion and bringing a gasp of anguish from the fallen player, often signifying an injury of some sort. But its biggest failing, though, relates to the difficulty level. I mean, it's just far too easy to score, especially in a 1-to-1 with a goalkeeper who is easily beaten by a simple kick from close range. Meanwhile, your stupid opponents seem incapable of creating a chance, although if you do contrive to give the ball away in defence areas, you'll find your own goalkeeper is as easily beaten as your opponents. And another main area of concern is the frequency of injuries. However, despite the improbable speed with which your first choice team becomes depleted, it rarely has much impact on the pitch thanks to the general lack of challenge. Now, European Club Edition evidently didn't have the required licenses in place for authentic player names. In fact, there's a general low-budget feeling to the whole affair. I mean, compared to the FIFAs and even actual soccers of the day, this seems a bit cheap and silly. I was also struggling to identify the commentator until the credits revealed it was actually Jon Hare, who evidently is multitasking on this title because he also sings the catchy "Football Is Our Love" theme tune in the intro video. So overall for me, Sensible Soccer European Club Edition is not particularly good. Sure, there is some fun to be had here, but the window of enjoyment is pretty small, particularly in a single player at least, due to the low difficulty. Not my best football game, I have to say. I was more FIFA and the actual soccer, I have to be honest.
For safety. It was inside the box.
Okay, we're now reaching the final chapter and the final development period for Sensible Software. Now, if we go back to May 1995, the studio signed a £3 million contract with Warner, which had bought Renegade for 3 games. Excited, they don't know that they've just signed their downfall. And so, this now brings us to our next 2 games, Have a Nice Day and the infamous Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll. But before we get to Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, let's look at the first game that failed for the release of the PlayStation, which is the action game titled Have a Nice Day, also known as Office Chair Massacre. Now, though screenshots have never been released, it was a first-person shooter inspired somewhat by the simplicity of Reloaded, a first-generation PlayStation game by Gremlin Interactive. If you can imagine yourself in a wheelchair with wheels, with each arm set equipped with a firearm. If you shoot with both at the same time, you're thrown backwards, but with only one, you turn on yourself. A kind of upside-down tank control in short. From a strange shooter, the concept evolves into a satire of the corporation world. Competing with other managers for the boss's attention, you shoot your company's employees for their sales. The territory defence aspect is all the more advanced when you can attack other managers or turn employees into defenders. The game takes place in the United States and we can go from one city to another according to its promotions, and there's new types of employees which emerge, such as marketing people, lawyers and accountants, which enriches this strategy aspect. However, again, as much as the concept would work in 2D, like Cannon Fodder in The Office, Chris struggles with the 3D, with its collisions and his camera to manage, especially since they move backwards. The game eventually reached a playable form, but not technically perfect. Again, the dreaded 3D got the better of Sensible Software. However, they weren't alone, this was also the same case for the Bitmap brothers. Dearie me. Now, this leads us on to Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, which was going to be an ambitious point-and-click adventure game that was in development by Sensible Software for the PC from 1994 to 1998. Initially, the project was being signed by Warner International Entertainment and later by GT Software, but for various technical and controversial problems, the game had to be cancelled in the end. However, at this particular point of time, it was fair to say that Jon and Chris were looking for a smooth exit. I mean, that burden of signing a £3 million contract must have caused Jon and Chris a lot of pressure and stress. Many consider Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll as a game that brought Sensible Software to its knees. The development of the game reached about 60%, with a script almost finished, a 1,500 page design document with a script ready to use because it is written in a pseudocode including 250 to 300 characters. It's mostly the gameplay that was never really implemented though. Perhaps the most accomplished part of the game is the ambitious original music that spans the 4 decades of the title's storyline. Anyway, the game was designed as a Leisure Suit Larry style point-and-click adventure game about the singer Nigel Staniforth Smith. And Nigel, well, he borrowed £2,000 of some Hells Angels to buy himself a beaten up old van so that he could go touring with this trashy rock band. And Nigel, well, he had a bit of a drug problem. In fact, he had 7 separate drug habits, all of which needed to be supported simultaneously. Now, these drugs were certainly core to the gameplay, as speed made the game speed up, heroin made the game slow down, acid made him see things that weren't there, and cocaine, well, that made him talk shit. It was all great gameplay mechanics in all fairness. And of course, the other little problem for Nigel was that the Hells Angels were quite keen on getting their money back. In fact, Nigel only had 2 weeks left before they lost their patience and came round to his house to kick the shit out of him, and then it's game over. Now, various changes happened to the game plot in 1995. At Warner's behest, they got rid of the pimping angle in the game and also his total reliance on his 7 drug habits. His drug taking had now become recreational rather than dependent. How trendy. And as I've already mentioned, the game was to include 150 characters, all of whom were earmarked for 3D modelling. And this would later become a serious reason for the problems that later ensued, not just for Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, but for all the games signed under the new Warner deal. Also, the programming side of the game was starting to reveal some serious problems. They had been careless in their selection of a lead programmer, and his incompetence was starting to show. So they decided to make some serious changes. Firstly, the game was reduced to a more realistic 24 locations, and they slimmed it down to 4 discs rather than 16. Crucially, they also got rid of their lead programmer and replaced him with a new guy from the Bitmap brothers, but they had already lost a year on the programming and the game was still not at all playable. Also, the other major change to take place in 1997 was the publisher. Warner had decided to bow out of the games business and sold its publishing arm to GT Interactive. And unfortunately, GT Interactive was backed by the people behind Walmart. And this was run by the strictest, most down-the-line Bible Belt Americans that you could ever wish to meet. And what happened next, they should have seen coming from the moment the ink dried on the Warner GT agreement. Let's just say that an 18-plus game about snorting cocaine and shagging girls in cars was not GT's ideal family value. So GT really started to turn the screw on Sensible Software by refusing to pay them anything. This game was certainly not an easy sell by any stretch of the imagination, even if people did like the little that they could show them. No one could see how this offensive game could find its way onto shelves in the US. I mean, you must remember this was before GTA. So, despite the fact that 90% of the script, 80% of the sound and 75% of the art was complete, the programme was still only 50% complete. And with the result of the cancellation of Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, Jon lost all motivation for 5 years. But in saying all that, at least both Jon and Chris no longer suffered from the pressure that prevents them from sleeping at night because of the fear of having to repay the advance one day. And nor do they need to wait for this breach of contract that would eventually be given by GT Interactive. So at least that was the positive. And freed from this burdensome contract, the duo sold their equipment and closed up shop around October 1998. They both shared the money and then continued to receive royalties from Sensible World of Soccer, which allowed them to return to profit after a period of self-financing. And then, Sensible Soccer was sold in 1999 to veteran UK games publishers Codemasters. Neither Jon nor Chris are bitter after the sale of the company, its licenses and the royalties associated with Codemasters. They don't really have a taste for development anymore, at least not in the form it reached at the end of the 1990s. Managing a company of 80 employees would not have stuck to the rock band philosophy. It is fair to say that the video game industry had changed, especially in the United Kingdom, where many studios had disappeared in the space of a few years. Chris and Jon were ideally complementary, one taking care of the technical part and the other the artistic side. They certainly did understand each other, however, Chris was bored at the end, but they were never contested, and yet, when the adventure was over, they never saw each other again. That's quite sad. However, since the sale of Sensible Software to Codemasters in 1999, Hare has worked in the capacity of a consultant designer on many games, including numerous strategy, action and sports games, including Cannon Fodder, Sensible Soccer 2006 and Sensible World of Soccer. So, let's have a look at these games that were released by Codemasters. So the first game worth mentioning from Codemasters is Cannon Fodder, which was released in 2000 for the Game Boy Color. With the trend of developers cutting corners wherever possible in the Game Boy Color title's development, it's an incredibly refreshing change to see what the developers of Cannon Fodder insisted be put into the portable version. Okay, sure, the team did have the luxury of a 4 megabyte cartridge, but most other Game Boy Color games are usually 1 or 2 megabytes in size. So the guys over at Codemasters certainly put the size to excellent use. Yes, there's a pure fluff full motion video introduction, but man, the detail on that flick is so detailed, it's so crisp that it's easily up to par with the cleanest PSX presentations and has digitised music running along with it. But let's put that intro aside for a second. Much of the cartridge's space is dedicated to a recorded audio of several different characters. It's so crisp that it's hard to believe it's coming out of the dinky speaker on the lower right of the system. And also a hearty chunk of cartridge space is also responsible for some of the largest and most detailed level maps used in a Game Boy Color game. And of course it wouldn't be right leaving out a mention of the extremely clever 3D rendered menu that has to be seen to be appreciated.
It is him.
Next up is Sensible Soccer 2006. And this was released for Windows, PlayStation 2 and Xbox on the 9th of June 2006. And Codemasters released the game across all PAL territories with the design capabilities overseen by the talented Jon Hare. As with the original 1992 game, Sensible Soccer 2006 is a fast-paced football game viewed from a bird's perspective, although the camera has been slightly tilted. The control has also gone from one button to 3 buttons, as you can use one for shooting, another for passing and the third for sprinting. In addition to that, you can also use the stick on the gamepad to aim and to apply the famous aftertouch. The game contains a total of around 350 different teams, both international and club teams, and also 50 preset competitions. If that's not enough, then players can create their own custom teams. And this is the career mode of the game. And the objective, well, is to create a squad of rookie players and take them to the top of the team rankings. As you succeed, you will earn skill points and you can use them to increase the quality of your team. Sensible Soccer 2006 offers multiplayer matches, but there's no online play. And you can play up to 4 players at once, in which 2 players share the control of a team. Another feature left from the original game is the possibility for players to create their own competitions, leagues, cups and tournaments. Another game worth mentioning was Sensible Soccer Skills. And this is a mobile Java title of the Sensible Soccer series developed in 2006 by Cobra Mobile and published by Codemasters. And Sensible Soccer Skills brings the fun of the original 2D football game to your phone and a series of challenges and mini-games. It's a basic game, but in the game you practice useful skills such as penalty taking, free kicks and volleying in a game that retains the look and feel and sense of the fun of its famous predecessor. It's an okay game. I mean, what should you expect from a 2006 mobile phone game? In 2006, Codemasters announced a new version of Sensible World of Soccer, developed by QJU Sheffield for the Xbox 360 to be released in the summer of 2007 on Xbox Live Arcade. It features both the classic retro visuals of the original Sensible World of Soccer, as well as new improved high-definition graphics, and retains the exact gameplay of the 96-97 version of Sensible World of Soccer for the Amiga, along with the music from Sensible Soccer 2006. Due to problems with the game's network performance, the release was delayed in order for significant proportions of the network code to be rewritten. After missing several previous release dates, the game appeared on Xbox Live Arcade on the 19th of December 2007, but again was quickly pulled. And a statement from Microsoft confirmed that the incorrect version of the game had been made available, in which online play was not possible. But it wasn't the end of the world, because the fixed version of the game was released 2 days later on the 21st of December. And the Windows version, well, that was never released. In 2008, Codemasters licensed a Russian company called Game Factory Interactive to develop Cannon Fodder 3. Codemasters, Jon Hare, nor anyone else related to Sensible had anything to do with the making of Cannon Fodder 3. GFI was initially permitted only to release the game in Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States, and the possibility of a wider European or North American release was a little bit unclear at the time. GFI, an unknown or little known company, published the game in Russia in December. But the game was eventually released via Gamersgate in Europe and North America on the 9th of February 2012. Now, GFI stated the developers attempted to retain the most appealing elements of the original Cannon Fodder while attracting new players. GFI also attempted to retain Cannon Fodder's anti-militarist message and was most proud of the new destructive environment. The developers also broadened the variety of weapons and vehicles and changed the level structure by adding submissions. But overall, the reception of Cannon Fodder 3 has been largely negative. Critics have pointed out that it lacks the heart and soul of the original games, feeling more like a tedious imitation rather than a worthy sequel. For me, in summary, while Cannon Fodder 3 attempts to revive a beloved franchise, it struggles with the execution and design flaws that hinder its potential. Perhaps fans of the original games may find some nostalgic elements, but many will likely be disappointed by the overall experience. And I have to say, I'm one of those guys. I was a bit disappointed. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Hare is also one of the founders and owners of the games company Tower Studios, founded in 2004 with two former Bitmap brothers, Mike Montgomery and John Phillips. They developed a number of successful titles, including mobile phone versions of Cannon Fodder and Sensible Soccer. Both John and Mike had been friends from way back as far as Sensible Soccer, which Renegade published. And Tower Studios was to make mobile games before smartphones took over the market. They did very well for 2 years, but then interest in mobile development nosedived, and there was simply not enough money for the three of them, so Jon and Mike both moved on. Jon Hare has since taken over the reins, and he does continue to maintain ties with Montgomery. And Jon looked after some of the bitmap titles for Mike. You know, he finds developers and publishers he approves of, and then manages all the design and contracts, and then works to bring the games to the market. There's clearly a strong relationship as well as a lot of respect between these two giants of British games design. In fact, Tower's most successful title as a publisher to date has been Speedball 2 Evolution, a remake of the Bitmap Brothers classic game, which topped the iPad and Mac charts across Europe in 2011, and then it was followed up by Speedball 2 HD in 2013 on the PC. And also in 2014, Hare also announced the imminent release of Word Explorer, his first original game in 20 years.
I've done things like Sensible Soccer, Cannon Fodder, Wizball in the past, and this is my first original game for about 17 years. I'm really excited about it, to have this opportunity, and the game's called Word Explorer. The concept behind Word Explorer is it's taking a crossword and turning it into something for the 21st century. It's an interactive crossword with pictures. The grids are kind of drawn over a map of a part of the world. They're like roads forking out across the map. So the way the game starts, you can start anywhere. You travel the world, literally with the crosswords, and whilst you're travelling, you're taking photographs, you're collecting photographs. You end up with a 2,500 page photo collection with all little facts, because we give you a little fact about each place. Animals, like a bobcat or a skimmer, which is a bird which flies along the coast, or a rattlesnake. They really are very beautiful photographs. It's quite a fast word game. It's a very intuitive, easy to use system. If you finish it in a certain time, it gives you a bonus. If you get a certain number of words right in a string, we call that a combo, it gives you a bonus. If you finish the whole level with no mistakes, we give you what we call a perfect bonus. And all these bonuses, by the way, are photographs. So it's just additional photographs related to that region. Most crossword games, you type in the answer. In our game, you don't. You got the question for the clue, and the answer's there in another game. You're just switching the letters around. If you guess wrong, you can have a second guess a lot of the time anyway. It's very forgiving. You can play it in what we call easy or pro mode. So pro mode is against the clock, but you get bonus photos. We have easy mode, which gives you no time pressure at all. You can take all the time in the world. I think I can safely say we've made the biggest single player word game that's ever existed by a large factor. I mean, there are over 250 levels in the game, just under 2,500 photos. The vocabulary which constructs the crosswords is taken from a 23,000 word dictionary. And then on top of the single player game, we have a multiplayer league game that will just generate the same grid for the two people, and it's who can get the highest score within a time limit of 3 minutes. And what's nice is the single player, which is the bulk of the game, feeds into the multiplayer as well. And we've got little things like different music for each region. In Mexico, you've got Mexican music. In the West Coast, you've got something that sounds a bit like Pulp Fiction theme. East Coast states, you've got like some hip hop. You get a very strong sense of travelling around the world in your armchair. It's a brilliant travelling game. If you're in a car, on a plane, in a train, across a very, very wide range of age groups and across all the different formats. I'm really, really happy that it's been brought to life. Everybody that sees it loves the game. Microsoft really like it, Apple really like it, Nintendo really like it. And my vision for Word Explorer is much larger.
Then, in 2016, via exhibitions in the London Science Museum, Gamescom, and numerous other European games events, Jon Hare demonstrated the continued development of a spiritual successor to Sensible Soccer, Sociable Soccer. Development partnership with Finnish development team Combo Breaker on numerous PC, console, mobile and VR platforms, despite a cancellation Kickstarter for the game the previous year. The game was released on Steam Early Access on the 12th of October 2017. And Sociable Soccer went on to become one of the early titles on the Apple Arcade service in 2019 also. And the game was also updated every year from there onwards. And then finally, in November 2024, Sociable Soccer 25 was released for the PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, iOS and Android. And I have to say, Sociable Soccer has good feedback from players, and it is currently the last game made by Jon. And then finally, in February 2025, Jon was honoured with the Most Influential Person Award at the Debug Indie Games Awards. This award recognises significant impact on the indie gaming scene, particularly for his work on Sensible Soccer and his current role as CEO of Tower Studios. I have to say, the guy deserves it. For me, he's an absolute gaming legend. Spot on, Jon. Spot on. So, there you go, that was my video covering the history and games of Sensible Software. So much nostalgia, particularly with revisiting both Megalomania and Sensible Soccer, both of which I played many hours in my younger days. For me, and I'm sure for many others, it was sad that Sensible Software was a short-lived tale. I mean, perhaps if they had mastered the 3D technology at the time when it was needed, it might have been another story. And also, it's fair to say that they were just a little bit way ahead of their time with their more ambitious projects such as Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, and this is years before GTA. The industry just was simply not ready for this kind of game. However, the games and memories of Sensei, they still live on. They were and they still are simply brilliant. So anyway, thank you for watching my lengthy video. It certainly took a lot of time to do this game, but it's very much appreciated that you watched it. Please leave a comment on your thoughts of Sensible Software and any of the games that you've played. I am interested, so please let me know. Now, please remember to like my video, and as always, it would be even better if you subscribe to my little but it's very much growing channel. That would be great. So until my next video, take care of yourself, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye bye.